I'd like to review some Seiko dive watch design history. Some of the watches I have, the ones I don't, I'll use pictures of. Let's start at the very beginning with the 6217 from 1965. Now, this watch is probably better known as the 62 MAS that was recently reissued, and unfortunately it ended up driving the price up of the original, which really makes me regret not buying one when they were much cheaper. Thanks a lot, scalpers. Regardless, if you look at the aesthetics of the case, you'll note that it's very basic and very angular. If you're at all familiar with Swiss dive watches from the 60s, you'll notice it's actually a pretty ubiquitous case. And here's an example of an Aquastar of the same vintage. Same case design right there. Very, very common. So I think it's safe to say for their first go-round, not much was put into the case design. The dial is unique, handset's unique, bezel's unique, but the case is very, very generic for the time. Now, again, this is 1965. Interestingly enough, just a few years later, in 1967, the 6215 was released, and in 1968, the 6159 was released. Now, these are the first truly unique case design attempts by Seiko. Anyone familiar with it will look at this and say, hey, that's the Marine Master. And this is, of course, where the Marine Master inspiration came from. This watch was much less angular, much more organic and curved, even though you'll notice there was no crown protection. It's a very, I think, beautiful and unique case, and even though there'll always be detractors who will say that Seiko stole or was inspired by Rolex, the reality is if you put a Submariner from the same vintage side by side, aside from the fact that they both have black dials and bezels, they're really different watches. The case is completely different and much more elegant, and the prices on these are incidentally really, really going up. I think there's some speculation there might be a reissue of this, but God knows how expensive and difficult that'll be. But the main take-home point is this really was Seiko's first attempt at an original design. So not bad from 65 to 67, 68. The next step was the 6105. Now this I can supply, and this, sorry about that. The 6105's main claim to fame was that it was a much more, as you would say, people would typically say, cushion case. It's rounder and to some extent flatter. On the right side, you have the asymmetrical hump that protects the crown. There is also another version of the 6105 that didn't have this, but it's much more of a boring, generic-looking watch and not really that valued by collectors for obvious reasons. And anyway, to continue, if you go from this 62 MAS to the 6159 to this, you're basically noticing that watch case is getting more round and much less angular, and there's much more emphasis on crown protection. This is also a very unique and iconic case, which to my knowledge has not been replicated by another company. So this is a second example of original Seiko dive watch design, also in the late 60s. Next we have the 6306/6309, which debuted in 76 and been around for quite a while. The 6306, incidentally, is Japan domestic market, whereas 6309 is worldwide. And this watch is even more cushioned than the 6105, and if you compare the two, the main thing you notice is they got rid of the hump, and they basically integrated crown protection into the case, though obviously less so. One thing, though, is the crown on this is telescoping and super, super beefy. I imagine that it would be much more difficult to damage this kind of crown than the older type crowns. But again, the general design emphasis is on round and cushioned and more streamlined, in that here you had this part poking out, whereas here it's much more streamlined going down at the cost of exposing the crown a little bit. These are super common. These are not common. I don't know what the manufacturing numbers are. Obviously, this was made for a very long period of time. In some respect, you can say as you went from the 6159 down to this, the design sort of became a bit more common, if you want to say, and less fancy. Whereas the 6159 was really elaborate, the 6105 was slightly elaborate on this side. The 6309 was much more, I guess, basic in that it was sort of a symmetrical design going around. That's my take on it. It sort of became more simple of a design. But this really stood the test of time. It was made for multiple decades, and these things are durable and reliable, and the cases hold up pretty well. So that's the next step. Now, After this, there was also a slimline version of 6309, and that basically led up to the 7002 and the SKX 007. I'm going to ignore those and move on to the next major design, and that was the reissue of the Marine Master back in 2000, and that's here. And basically, this was a modernized, beefier, heavier, larger version of the 6159. Now, since this was released in 2000, this has come out in all sorts of different versions. Gold, regular, it's been released under different model numbers, but it's really a larger version of the 6159 with a lower beat movement. And it's really just a wonderful, elegant watch. And again, if you put it next to the, well, at this point, I guess, let me just move this away. These together, and we'll substitute my Aquastar for a 62 MAS. There we go. Sorry about the light. We went from something very basic to the, well, the 6159, which is basically like this, to something somewhat unique, to something more simple, and then jump back to something very, very unique. Now, the main thing you have to keep in mind, though, is the times that we live in. When the 60s came, we're still in the 60s rather, if you scuba dived, you needed a reliable dive watch. So watches like the 62 MAS or any other watch that used this case, the 6105, and even probably the 6309 had to be reliable, were mission critical tools. They were tool watches, which is why these watches are typically beat up when you find them. By the time 2000 rolled around, and this was released though, it looked like a tool watch. It arguably is as reliable as one, but the reality is this is a decorative watch. And much like Rolex, the reality is the watches that they used to make, the tool watches, the mission critical watches, are simply no longer needed in our society. So watches like this and the Submariner have sort of taken on a new role, and that's more of a sort of a luxury sports watch, but more for aesthetics than anything else. And that's really what you have. But it's really interesting to see that, because, and this is why I always go on about how it's really nice when you have a company that was owned by the same family for a long period of time without going bankrupt or changing ownership, is that you see how the design has developed, but at the same time how it's taken from prior designs. And again, I mean, the initial case here you can't really count, but if you count, you know, going from the 6159, which is a super strong organic case design, then slowly rounding the cases, you went from the 6105 to the 6309, and then back to here. It's really interesting how they've continued to grow in aesthetics, but at the same time followed prior design inspirations. Now, the interesting thing is, after the Marine Master came about, the Marine Master 600 came out. And this main claim to fame is that this is a spring drive. This was, I believe, the first sports watch they ever used with a spring drive in it. And if you look at the older watches, obviously this has no similarities. And if you look at the 6105, well, the dial has some similarities and the crown's at 4, but it really doesn't have anything significant there. And the 6309, even less. It doesn't really gel. But if you look at the Marine Master, it's very obvious that this design grew straight from this. This is basically a beefed up version of this, and this is basically a beefed up version of the original 6159. So a lot of people had issue with just how large this is. For what it's worth, I'll say it's a lightweight watch. When it came out, it was really unique. And for me, that made it worth it. I realize different people have different opinions, but I really love the fact that they dug into their history and they paid tribute to it by releasing a new technology watch with strong design emphasis from their older models. Now, once this happened, I sort of haven't been paying too much attention to what was going on. And not too long ago, they released a high beat 2015, watch like this. And that thing made this watch look tiny. Now, again, they could claim it's 1,000-meter, it's a tool watch and everything, but at this point, these are just being released as luxury watches that probably won't see water. They're huge, and I mean, I know many people will laugh at me posting a wrist shot and say, haha, that looks ridiculous on you. But this watch really makes this one look tiny. And again, the same grammar of design, the same influences are clearly there from the case, but at this point, I don't really know where they're going. Even though if you're putting in a higher beat movement and everything, the cases are getting bigger and bigger, and I really just don't understand it. And recently, they just released the SBX 005, I believe, and that makes this watch look tiny. And again, I don't know. And again, the design legacy is still there, but where they're going with these new absolutely huge and bloated designs, I really don't know. And I know Rolex is doing the same thing with their Submariners as far as growing really fat lugs and everything. And clearly there's a market for these things, but aside from, it almost seems as if they're just paying lip service to their old designs as far as just making them bigger and bigger now. I really don't know. It really would be nice if they went back down a few notches for sizes, because this really is getting out of hand. So this is my little video reviewing the history that ended up becoming a bit of a diatribe. Sorry if it offended you, and that's about it. And as usual, thanks for watching.